Alright, so this is a story from when I worked as a security guard at a huge sawmill on the outskirts of town. This place was massive, surrounded by thick woods, and it was an eerie place to be at night. The kind of place where every creak of the building makes your heart skip a beat, and you're just waiting for something weird to happen. But man, I had no idea how weird things could get. I was 28 at the time, and it was my first security gig. The sawmill was in the middle of nowhere, with tall, dark trees all around it. The buildings were rusted, old, and creaked in the wind. I used to joke with myself that the place was straight out of a horror movie. It felt like that too, especially during my night shifts. The whole vibe was just off. But hey, it paid well, and I wasn't about to back down from the job, even if it did make me feel like I was living on the edge of some twisted mystery. My shift would start at 10 p.m., and I'd sit in the little guard shack at the entrance to the property. It was a small building, just enough for me, a chair, and a radio. I'd park my truck outside, lock up, and settle in for a long night of staring out into the empty woods. There wasn't much to do, really. I'd occasionally check security cameras, walk around the perimeter of the lot, and that was pretty much it. It was quiet. Too quiet. But hey, that was part of the job. I'd just listen to the radio, kill time, and keep my eyes peeled. One night, about 2 months into my shift, something happened that completely shattered my sense of security, and my sanity. It was around 2 a.m., and it was one of those chilly nights where the air feels thick and heavy. The fog had rolled in from the woods, and the whole place was blanketed in this eerie stillness. I remember the moon was barely visible through the thick fog, casting long shadows all around. The trees stood like dark sentinels, looming over the sawmill in the distance. I was sitting in my booth, half awake, trying to keep myself from dozing off, when I noticed something odd in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on me. But as I squinted out into the darkness, I realized I was seeing figures moving between the trees. I thought I was just seeing things, but then I saw them again, 3 dark figures, moving quickly and silently, like they were hunting something. It was unsettling. At first, I thought maybe they were just some trespassers. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but I figured I could deal with it. The last thing I wanted was to have to deal with any real trouble at this hour, but I didn't want to let them get away with whatever they were doing. I grabbed my flashlight, swung open the door, and started walking toward the tree line. The closer I got, the more I realized something wasn't right. These figures weren't just sneaking around. They were walking with purpose, like they knew what they were doing. And that was when I started to feel that cold, sickly feeling creeping up my spine. I called out to them, my voice shaky but loud, "Hey! What are you doing out here?" The figures didn't respond. They just kept moving, but now I could see they were dressed in something strange. It wasn't just plain clothes, it was robes. Black robes that fluttered with every step they took. And those hoods, man. Those hoods were deep, shadows swallowing their faces. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I knew this wasn't just a group of kids sneaking onto the property. Something was wrong. I started to feel a little bit more confident, thinking maybe I could scare them off. "Hey! You need to leave!" I shouted again, trying to sound braver than I felt. But then they did something that sent a chill through me. One of them, the one in the front, took off his hood, and I swear to God, he was wearing a skull on his head. A real skull, like something you'd see in a horror movie. That's when my brain finally caught up with the situation. These weren't just random trespassers. These were Satanists. I wasn't sure what they were doing, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to get out. I froze for a second, just staring at them. My mind was racing, but my body was stuck. Then, as if on cue, the guy with the skull on his head turned to look at me, and in that moment, everything changed. It was like he could see right through me. He gave this awful, sickening smile, like he knew something I didn't. Before I could even react, they started running toward me. Fast that I didn't know what the hell was going on, but all I knew in that moment was that they were coming for me. Fast. There was no hesitation in their movements, no fear in their eyes, just this eerie, unsettling focus. Their footsteps were almost silent against the wet ground, but I could hear the faint rustling of their robes as they got closer. In that moment, panic gripped me. My heart hammered in my chest like a jackhammer. I turned and bolted for the guard shack, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. It wasn't just fear, it was pure survival instinct. I knew I had to make it back to the booth, if I could get there in time. I looked over my shoulder just for a split second, big mistake. The skull-headed man was right behind me, his mouth stretched into this twisted grin that made my blood freeze. His eyes were wide, feverish, and he wasn't alone. The others, 2 men and a woman, both in those dark robes, were closing in too. There was no way they could be human. There was something wrong with them, wrong with the way they moved, the way they didn't seem to care about the distance between us. The path from the woods to the guard shack was long and winding, but I knew it well. I'd walked it 100 times. The trees around me were thick and twisted, casting long, crooked shadows across the path as the fog wrapped around the trunks like it was alive. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with fear. I had to keep moving. I had to get to safety. But I was too slow. I heard one of them yell, a voice deep and guttural, "Don't let him escape." It was a command, not a warning. The tone of it made my blood run cold. My feet slipped on the damp ground, and I nearly lost my footing as I stumbled forward. The cold night air bit at my skin, my clothes sticking to me with sweat. The trees around me swayed in the wind, but it felt like they were closing in, pressing down, trapping me. I reached the guard booth, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door handle. It wouldn't open. I yanked harder, feeling like I might tear the whole thing off its hinges. But it was locked. My stupid mind had completely forgotten to keep the key with me when I left. I looked over my shoulder again. The robed figures were gaining on me. I could see their faces now, pale, deathly pale, with eyes that glowed in the darkness, unnaturally bright, almost like they were illuminated from the inside. The skull-headed man was only a few yards away, his eyes fixed on me like a predator locking onto prey. God, I was going to die out here. I could hear their voices, muttering something low and unintelligible. It wasn't in any language I recognized. They were speaking too fast, like they were chanting. My heart pounded harder as I looked for anything that could help me get away. I ran to the side of the booth, where the trees started to grow thick again. I knew this area. The ground here was soft, mossy, and uneven, but it was my only shot. I couldn't stay in the open, couldn't let them catch me. I had to hide. I dove into the underbrush, pressing my back against a thick oak tree, trying to steady my breath. I felt the moisture from the ground seep through my jeans, but I didn't care. My heart was in my throat, and my hands were trembling as I pressed my palm over my mouth, trying to keep myself from breathing too loudly. I could hear them now, closer than before. Their footsteps were crunching through the leaves, the sound of their robes dragging against the earth. They were searching, and I was sure they could smell my fear. My mind raced as I tried to stay as still as possible, wishing I could shrink into the earth and disappear. The fog thickened around me, swirling in a dizzying pattern, making it harder to see or hear anything clearly. Don't breathe. Don't make a sound. I could feel their presence, like they were only a few feet away. The tension in the air was unbearable. My chest was tight, like my ribs were closing in on my lungs. The soft, damp earth pressed against me, but I dared not move. I stared straight ahead into the fog, hoping they wouldn't spot me. Then, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, came from the darkness. He's here. He has to be here. The chill in the voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like the voice wasn't human at all, but something from a place I couldn't comprehend. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me dead. I thought my heart was going to explode from the pressure in my chest. I could feel it in my throat, the pulse beating so hard it was almost like it was shaking me from the inside out. I stayed frozen, just barely breathing, trying not to move a single muscle. But the voices kept coming, whispering and muttering in the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't like a normal conversation. It was wrong. There was something otherworldly about it, like they weren't just speaking, they were casting a spell, or invoking something dark. It didn't make any sense, but every bone in my body screamed that whatever was happening, I shouldn't be involved. I could feel the cold sweat sliding down my back, soaking into my shirt. The humidity in the air wasn't helping. The fog clung to the trees, making everything look like a ghostly blur, and it seemed to thicken the closer they got to me. The deeper the fog became, the darker it felt, like it was closing in on me, wrapping around me. One of them, the woman, the one who'd been trailing behind, was closest. I could hear her footfalls, lighter than the men's, but still steady, almost graceful. It was like she was gliding, and it felt wrong, unnatural. Her voice echoed in the distance, "I can smell him." My stomach dropped. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Smell me? That's when it hit me. These weren't just people in robes, they were hunting me. And it wasn't just my life at risk. I could feel it deep in my gut. They were looking for something specific. Me. They wanted me for something. But I had no idea what it was, and that terrified me more than anything. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not with them so close. I had to stay quiet. I had to make sure they didn't hear my heartbeat pounding in the silence. My eyes flicked toward the path where I had run earlier. The guard shack was just out of view, but I couldn't go back there. I knew they'd be waiting for me. So, I made a split-second decision to head further into the woods, further away from the sawmill, hoping the dense trees would help me lose them. I took one step back, and the woman's voice cut through the fog like a knife. "He's there, in the trees." I saw him move. A cold chill ran down my spine. I was caught. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I turned and bolted deeper into the woods, my feet sinking into the damp earth as I ran. I had no plan. No idea where I was going. All I knew was I had to keep moving, keep running. Every branch seemed to reach out to grab me, but I didn't stop. I could hear them, closer. The man with the skull on his head was leading the charge now. His voice was louder, deeper. "He's running. Don't let him escape. He's not going to get away." I tripped, my foot catching on a root, and I stumbled forward, almost falling face first into the ground. My pulse surged. I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't stop. But in my panic, I lost my bearings. I couldn't hear the voices as clearly now, and for a moment, I thought I had shaken them off. But when I looked around, the trees were different, thicker, darker, stranger. It was like I had crossed into some other world. Where was I? The world felt twisted. The trees bent in ways they shouldn't, and the fog didn't seem to lift. It just kept swirling around, thick as smoke, choking off the air. I couldn't see clearly. I could barely even breathe. The air felt heavy, like it was suffocating me. I tried to steady myself, but I was in full-blown survival mode. I was terrified. The silence was just as dangerous as the sound of their footsteps. Every little creak in the woods felt like they were getting closer. But now, I wasn't sure if I was still running away from them, or if I was just running deeper into the trap. I was losing my mind. They were still out there. I could hear them. The man with the skull head's voice rang through the fog again. "We will find you, you can't hide forever." His voice echoed, warping and twisting through the trees. It sounded like a promise. A threat. In that moment, I realized I had made a fatal mistake. I had left my phone behind in the guard booth. There was no way to call for help. I was completely alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to hear me, no one to save me. I could feel the sweat dripping down my face, stinging my eyes, but I couldn't wipe it away. I had to survive. I kept running, blindly now, with no idea which direction I was heading. My legs burned with every step, but I pushed on. And that's when I heard it. A scream. A piercing, high-pitched sound that echoed through the trees. I froze. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't their voice. It was something else. I turned around slowly, my heart dropping into my stomach. Through the fog, I could make out the silhouette of a small, helpless creature. It was a lamb, white and small, its bleating shrill and desperate, like it was in pain. I hadn't seen it before, but now it was there, in the clearing, surrounded by the shadows of the figures. The woman stepped forward, her face twisted in a smile, and I knew in that moment what they had been hunting all along. The lamb. She raised her hand, and the others followed. The air grew thick with the smell of something foul. And that was when I realized, it wasn't just a ritual. They were performing some kind of sacrifice. The lamb's bleat was cut short. I could hear the sickening sound of something breaking. And then, silence that I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, like a vice had clamped down on it. The silence that followed the lamb's scream was unbearable. It was like the entire world had stopped. The only sound left was the thudding of my heart, pounding in my ears like a drum. I wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. They felt like they were cemented to the ground. My mind was screaming, telling me to get the hell out of there, but my body didn't listen. The figures were gathered around the lamb, crouched low in a circle. The skull-headed man raised his hands in the air, his eyes glowing like they weren't human anymore. There was something so wrong about the way he moved, like his body wasn't quite in sync with the world around him. He looked almost like a puppet on strings, his limbs jerking unnaturally as he chanted something under his breath. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them. It was like the air around me was charged with electricity, buzzing with power. Every word he spoke seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the life out of everything. The woman was kneeling beside the lamb, her hands pressed against its tiny body. I could see the blood, too much blood, spilling onto the ground. The lamb's body twitched, its last breath gasping in the thick, humid air. I wanted to look away. But I couldn't. My eyes were locked onto the scene before me, my body paralyzed by fear and horror. It felt like time had stopped, but at the same time, everything was moving in slow motion. The figures around the lamb were swaying in rhythm with the chant, like they were caught in some kind of trance. Their faces were all blank, their eyes wide and unblinking, lost in whatever dark power they were summoning. The skull-headed man raised his arms higher, his voice growing louder, more frantic. And then, it happened. The woman reached into the lamb's chest. I saw her fingers sink into its fur, her hands moving with an eerie calmness. There was no hesitation in her movements. She wasn't even shaking. The others watched, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. My stomach churned. I felt like I was going to be sick. The lamb's final scream echoed in the night air, and I felt it pierce me to my very core. My knees nearly buckled, but I couldn't look away. I had to see it. I had to know what was happening. And then, it was over. The lamb's body went limp. There was no more movement. No more sound. Just the cold, lifeless thing in the center of the circle. The figures stood up slowly, as if they were all in sync, their eyes fixed on the ground, like they were waiting for something. I had to get out. Now. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. My entire body was shaking with adrenaline, and every part of me screamed that I needed to get the hell out of there. I turned and ran, not even thinking about where I was going. I just needed to move, to get away from the horror, away from the twisted things I had just witnessed. But as I took a step, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, too many of them. They were coming after me. I didn't dare look back. I just pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, faster. I could feel them gaining on me. I was too slow. I wasn't going to make it. But then, I saw something in the distance, a break in the trees. It was the edge of the woods, and beyond that, the clearing that led to the road. I had to make it there. I forced my body to move faster, willing myself to reach the edge. The fog was thick again, and the trees seemed to be closing in on me, like they were pushing me back into the darkness. But I couldn't stop. I was so close now. Just a few more steps. The sound of their pursuit was so close I could feel it, like their breath on the back of my neck. But when I finally broke through the trees and saw the road ahead, I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. I ran into the clearing, the wide open space feeling like a breath of fresh air after being trapped in the suffocating woods. I kept running, my eyes fixed on the headlights of my truck parked at the edge of the lot. I made it. I reached my truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. But they were still out there. I could feel it. The fog swirling in the distance, the trees just beyond the clearing, they were still out there, watching me. I drove off as fast as I could, not daring to look back, my eyes glued to the road ahead. My heart was still racing, my hands still trembling. But I was alive. Barely, the road seemed endless as I sped away, the headlights cutting through the fog like a blade. I couldn't stop shaking. My hands were still gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My mind was spinning, replaying every single moment of what I had just witnessed in those woods. The lamb. The chanting. The blood. My mind couldn't process it. It felt like a nightmare, like I'd stumbled into some kind of hell, and now I was trying to wake up, but the horror wouldn't let me go. I wasn't sure how far I'd driven. I just knew I had to get as far away from that place as possible. I glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see their faces staring back at me, those pale, glowing eyes, the twisted expressions on their faces. But all I saw was the empty road behind me, swallowed by the thick fog. The entire drive back to town felt like a blur. My mind was foggy too, filled with the images of the woods, of the dark ritual, of the blood-soaked ground. But there was one thing that kept pushing to the front of my thoughts: I couldn't go back. Not to the sawmill. Not to that place. I wasn't sure if I even believed in all that cult stuff, but what I saw, there was no way to explain it. Those people, those things, they weren't human. I finally made it to the outskirts of town, my truck jerking over the uneven road as I pulled into the parking lot of the gas station. I parked the truck and sat there for a while, staring at the dashboard. My fingers still twitched with fear, but I felt alive, somehow. I didn't know if I'd ever feel normal again, but at least I had made it out. But then it hit me. I hadn't called anyone. I hadn't told anyone what I had seen. I hadn't even told the police. They wouldn't believe me, would they? I could already hear their voices in my head. "Oh, you were just scared. You probably imagined it." I couldn't imagine the looks I'd get if I told them what I saw. The look of pity. The look of doubt. No one would believe it. And if they did, what would they do? Nothing. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and dialed the number of the shift manager at the sawmill, Greg. My fingers felt numb as I pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hello." Greg's voice was groggy, like he'd just woken up. "Greg," I said, trying to steady my voice, but it cracked anyway. "You need to send someone out there. I don't care who it is. The woods, the people, there's something wrong. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he muttered, "You okay, man?" "No, I'm not okay." "You need to send someone," I insisted, nearly shouting into the phone. "Now. It's a cult, Greg. They're performing rituals, sacrificing animals. I saw it. I saw everything. You have to believe me." There was a silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Greg spoke, but his voice was cold, dismissive. "Calm down, dude. I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing out there. We've got patrols. Nothing's happened. Just get some rest. I'll see you in the morning. We'll talk then." The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and slammed my fist into the wheel. He wasn't going to help. No one would. It was like I was living in a different reality, one where the horrors I'd witnessed didn't exist. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't stay in that town. I drove straight to the diner. It was the only place I knew where people would be awake at this hour. It was 4 a.m., but there was always someone sitting in the corner, sipping coffee and minding their business. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. I walked in, still shaking, my heart racing, and ordered the first coffee they had. The waitress, a woman named Carol, looked at me with concern, but I didn't care. She could see it in my eyes, the fear, the panic, but I couldn't talk to her about it. She wouldn't believe me either. As I sat there, trying to calm my nerves, my mind kept wandering back to the woods. To the lamb. The blood. The robed figures. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me. Around 6 a.m., I got up, paid the bill, and left. But when I got back to my truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The parking lot was empty, except for one car. A black sedan. And as I looked closer, I could see the faint glow of eyes through the tinted windows, watching me. I froze. My hand was still on the door handle of my truck, but I couldn't move. That black sedan, it didn't belong here. It wasn't a car from the town, and it certainly wasn't anyone from the sawmill. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew they were out there, watching me. I didn't dare look back at the sedan. I couldn't. It felt like the moment I turned my head, I'd be pulled into whatever nightmare they were preparing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, stuck in this moment of terror. I glanced over my shoulder as discreetly as I could. The fog had thickened again, covering the street and spilling into the parking lot. It felt like the fog was moving closer, pulling in around me, pushing the world into a haze of gray and black. I couldn't see much through the mist, but I could swear I saw movement, shadows shifting behind the tinted windows. Someone, or something, was watching me. Waiting. I wanted to bolt, to get in my truck and drive away, but the feeling of being trapped, of being stalked, held me in place. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on my forehead. For what felt like an eternity, I just stood there, trying to ignore the prickling sensation that ran down my spine. The eyes in the sedan were still on me, I was sure of it. But no one moved, no one got out of the car. It was like we were locked in this silent standoff, both sides waiting for the other to make the first move. And then, I heard it. A low, muffled sound, like a whisper cutting through the fog. It was coming from the woods, not far from the parking lot. The same direction I had run last night. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. It was the same whispering I had heard in the forest. That's when I realized, they knew I was here. They had found me. I spun around, my heart racing. The hairs on my arms stood up. My truck was parked in the corner of the lot, but something felt wrong. It felt exposed. Too close to the woods. Too close to the unknown. Without thinking, I rushed toward my truck. I didn't care if I was making noise now. I needed to get out. The weight of that black sedan, the eyes I couldn't escape, the whispering coming from the trees, it was all too much. I couldn't breathe. As I got to the driver's side door, I glanced back one last time. The sedan was still there, its headlights dim, as if it was waiting. Watching. I slammed the door of my truck, turned the ignition key, and the engine roared to life. The tires screeched as I peeled out of the parking lot, not even bothering to look in the rearview mirror. I drove fast, too fast. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Where could I go? The town was too small to disappear. The woods? I couldn't go back to those woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. That they weren't just after me, they were after something else. Something more. I drove through the winding back roads, the trees closing in on either side. The fog hadn't lifted, and now it felt like I was trapped in a dream, unable to escape. At some point, I realized I was too far out to turn back, too far into unfamiliar territory. I slowed down, looking for a place to stop. I needed to think, to plan. I had to get out of this nightmare, but I couldn't do it alone. That's when I saw it. The gas station. A little shack in the middle of nowhere. I pulled in and parked in the dim light of the station's flickering neon sign. I got out of the truck, my legs still trembling from the adrenaline. The place was silent. Not a soul in sight. The air felt heavy, thick with that strange, suffocating energy I couldn't explain. I stood there, looking around. The station felt like it was stuck in time, like the rest of the world had forgotten about it. It was old enough that the paint on the walls was peeling, the windows fogged over with years of dust. There was an eerie stillness, like the place hadn't seen a customer in ages. I didn't want to go inside. Something about it didn't feel right. But I had no choice. I opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit space. The air was stale, and the shelves were filled with dusty cans and bottles that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A woman sat behind the counter, her head down, scribbling on a notepad. She looked up at me when I entered, her face blank, her eyes wide with a kind of unsettling curiosity. "You all right?" she asked, her voice hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. I didn't know how to answer that. Was I all right? "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." Her eyes flicked toward the door, as if she was listening for something. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something else, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded slowly, as if she already knew what was going to happen. "I've seen them too," she said softly, barely above a murmur. "You're not the first." Her words hit me like a brick. "You're not the first." I stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest. She knew. She knew about them. She knew what I had seen. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't been going crazy. They were real. I took a step toward the counter, my breath ragged as I tried to hold it together. "What do you mean? Who are they? What is all this?" The woman's eyes flickered nervously to the door again, her face pale as if she was scared to speak. She wiped her hands on her apron, hesitating. "I don't want to get involved, but you're already in it, aren't you? They always find a way." I wasn't sure I wanted to hear more, but I couldn't stop myself. "What's going on? Please, tell me. I don't know who to trust anymore." She sighed deeply, a tremor in her voice. "They're not from here. Not really. They come and go, but they never really leave. They have power. People like you and me. We're nothing to them. Just pawns in their game." I shook my head. "What game? What do you mean?" She looked around again, her eyes darting toward the window, like she expected someone to be watching. "They call themselves the Children of the Fog. They come out of nowhere. Some people say they're after sacrifices, others think they're controlling things, spreading darkness. She swallowed hard, voice barely audible. I've seen them before. In the woods. Out by the sawmill. They pick people out. And when they do, they never let go. My stomach dropped. It was as if everything I had feared about them, everything I had witnessed, was coming together in that moment. The fog. The shadows. The robed figures. They were hunting me. And if I stayed here, they'd catch me. I didn't know what to do. There was no escape. I was already trapped. The fog's always a sign, she whispered. If you see it, you're already marked. Don't try to run. They'll just find you again. I turned to leave, my hands shaking. I didn't know what else to say to her. I couldn't stay there another second. I had to keep moving. I had to survive. The door swung open, and I stepped out into the heavy, damp air of the night. It was colder now. The fog was thicker. I could barely see the road in front of me, but I could feel them, close. I didn't even know if I was running in the right direction anymore. I just needed to get away. But then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, echoing in the fog. Someone, no, something, was following me. I froze. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall and menacing, its face hidden beneath the hood of a black robe. I recognized the figure. It was the same one who had been at the ritual last night. The skull-headed man. I backed away, my mind screaming, but my feet wouldn't move. I was caught in the same trap I'd been running from since that first moment I saw them in the woods. And then, more figures emerged from the mist. They were everywhere now, surrounding me, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly from under their hoods. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to paralyze me. In the distance, I heard the woman from the gas station scream. I heard the sounds of chanting, growing louder as they closed in around me. I didn't know how much time passed, but when I finally managed to tear my gaze away from the figures, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The flames. A fire had started just behind them. A small bonfire, crackling with bright orange and yellow flames. And in front of it, the lamb's carcass, still bloody, draped across a pile of rocks. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. And then, as quickly as it had all started, it stopped. The figures dispersed, their footsteps silent in the fog. The fire burned quietly, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. The fog seemed to retreat, slowly pulling back into the forest like it had never been there at all. I stood there, numb, for what felt like hours, unable to process what had just happened. The fear, the horror, the realization that I had escaped, but only for a moment. I don't know why they stopped. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they just wanted to make sure I knew I was theirs now. But I do know this, I couldn't stay here anymore. When the first rays of dawn broke through the fog, I drove out of town. I didn't stop for gas. I didn't stop for anything. I left behind my truck, my life, everything. The sawmill, the fog, the shadows, I left it all behind. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know if I'll ever be safe. But I do know one thing for sure, they're still out there. Watching. Waiting. And they're never far behind.